When will you ever do something real with your life? That was my father's exact question. Not, how are you doing or what are you working on? Just that. Delivered across the Thanksgiving table like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed 100 times. My brother smirked into his wine glass. My mother busied herself refilling the bread basket, which meant she'd decided not to intervene. I was 23 years old, sitting in my childhood home in Columbus, Ohio, wearing a sweater I'd bought from a thrift store because I was genuinely counting dollars that month. I had a laptop back in my apartment with 17 browser tabs open, 3 client emails I needed to answer, and a small graphic design business I'd been quietly building for 8 months. It wasn't making much yet, but it was mine. I said, "I'm doing fine, Dad." "The business is growing." He set down his fork. "A business? You call it a business? Serena, you're designing logos for coffee shops on the internet. Your cousin Marcus just made partner at his firm. Your brother has a real career path, and you're what? Freelancing." He said freelancing the way someone says loitering. My brother, I'll call him by what he was that year, which was insufferable, leaned back in his chair and said, "She'll figure it out eventually. Some people just take longer." He was 28 and had recently been promoted to senior analyst at our father's commercial real estate company. He had strong opinions about everything and had been wrong about most of them his entire life, but no one in that house ever pointed that out. I didn't respond. I picked up my fork and ate my green beans and looked out the window at the bare November yard and thought, I will not be here like this in 5 years. I didn't know what that meant yet. I just knew it the way you know things in your chest. Before your brain catches up, I drove back to my apartment that night and sat at my desk and opened my laptop and answered those 3 client emails. Then I started working on a project I'd been thinking about for 6 months, a digital marketplace for independent artists and illustrators to license their work directly to brands, cutting out the agencies and middlemen who took cuts so large the artists themselves were barely surviving. I'd watched it happen to people I knew. I'd watched talented friends take bad deals because they had no leverage and no platform and no one in their corner. I knew what it felt like to be underestimated and underpaid and overlooked. I figured that was as good a reason as any to start something. I called it Lumen. I didn't tell my family. There was nothing to tell yet, just an idea and some wireframes and a lot of late nights. And honestly, after that Thanksgiving, I didn't particularly feel like sharing. My father owned Blake Capital Partners, a commercial real estate investment firm he'd built over 30 years. It was legitimate and profitable, and my brother had joined right out of college, which my father considered the natural order of things. When I graduated with a degree in visual communications and said I wasn't joining the company, my father treated it like a phase. When the phase lasted past 1 year, then 2, he treated it like a character flaw. By year 3, we developed a kind of cold routine. I'd come to family dinners, he'd make a comment, I'd deflect, nothing got resolved. My mother stayed neutral in that exhausting way that isn't actually neutral, it just means someone else absorbs the friction. The thing about building something slowly is that you can't explain it to people who need visible proof of progress. Lumen didn't look like much for the first 2 years. I was still doing freelance work on the side to pay rent. I was eating a lot of rice and frozen vegetables. I had a studio apartment in Clintonville that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cats. I was not, by any external measure, thriving, but the platform was growing, slowly, then a little faster. I'd spent a year recruiting artists. Not famous ones, just genuinely talented people who were getting undervalued. I wrote every onboarding email personally. I handled support tickets at midnight. I learned more about licensing law than I ever expected to know. I made mistakes and fixed them and made different mistakes. When the platform turned 1, I had 400 artists and a few dozen brand partnerships. Small brands mostly, local companies. A regional outdoor gear company. A mid-sized cosmetic startup in Austin. At year 2, a packaging company in Seattle did a campaign using Lumen artists, and it went modestly viral. One of the illustrations ended up on the front page of a design blog with 3 million monthly readers. That week, I got 200 new artist applications and 30 brand inquiries. I remember sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, watching the inquiry counter tick up, eating cereal out of the box, thinking, okay, something is actually happening here. I hired my first employee that spring. Her name was Claudia. She was a recent grad who was overqualified for what I could afford to pay her, and she took the job anyway because she believed in what we were building. Hiring her felt enormous. It felt real in a way that was almost frightening, like the thing had weight now, like there were stakes. I did not call my father to tell him. I came home for Christmas that year, and my father asked, over dinner, whether I'd looked into any real opportunities lately. My brother nodded in that agreeable way he had, the way that meant he'd decided to side with authority. My mother passed the potatoes. I said I was doing fine and asked about my uncle's new house in Phoenix and steered the conversation somewhere harmless, and we all pretended that exchange hadn't happened. I was 26. Lumen had just crossed $800,000 in annual revenue. I had 4 employees. I had a wait list for new brand partnerships. I didn't say any of that. I think people who haven't been in that dynamic don't fully understand why you wouldn't just say it. Why not just tell them? Why suffer in silence when you could prove them wrong right then? But it's not that simple. There's a version of telling them that feels like you're asking for their approval, and I had spent enough years not getting that approval that I didn't want to need it anymore. I wanted to reach a point where what they thought genuinely didn't matter. Not because I'd suppressed it, but because I'd built something so real and so mine that their skepticism had nowhere to land. So I kept building. Year 4, Lumen crossed $2 million in revenue. I moved out of the cat smell apartment into a 2-bedroom unit with a real home office. I hired 3 more people. I signed our first Fortune 500 partnership, a consumer goods company out of Chicago that wanted to run a full product rebrand using exclusively independent artists. That deal alone was worth more than my father's assessment of my entire career. Year 5, I took a small seed round, $1.2 million, from a Chicago-based venture firm that had been watching the platform for 2 quarters. I remember the wire hitting my business account and just sitting there at my desk for a very long time. Not celebrating, just sitting, thinking about the thrift store sweater and the green beans and my father's voice saying the word freelancing like it tasted bad. I called my mother that night, not to tell her about the funding, just to say hi. She asked if I was eating enough. I said yes. She said good. We talked for 20 minutes about my cousin's new baby. I hung up and went back to work. My father's company, Blake Capital Partners, had a rough stretch around that same time. Commercial real estate was going through a correction. Deals that had looked solid were getting repriced, and a couple of long-term tenants in their portfolio had gone remote permanently and broken their leases. My brother called me once during that period not to check in but to vent about how stressful things were at work, how our father was being difficult, how the team was overwhelmed. He talked for 40 minutes. He did not once ask how I was doing or what I was working on. I listened. I said, "That sounds really hard." I meant it mostly. What I didn't mention was that Lumen had recently done a campaign with a commercial real estate tech startup, and in the course of that relationship, I'd learned a lot about which sectors were getting squeezed and why. I had a pretty clear picture of where Blake Capital Partners stood. It wasn't dire, but it wasn't comfortable. My brother didn't know I knew. He had no idea what Lumen actually was, or what I'd been building, because no one in my family had ever asked. I found out about the real trouble a few months later, not from my family, but from a mutual contact, a woman named Gail who'd worked with my father for years and occasionally kept me loosely in the loop on family business. She called me on a Tuesday and said carefully that things at Blake Capital were more serious than my brother's venting had suggested. They'd lost 2 major anchor tenants, a refinancing had fallen through, and they were looking at a cash liquidity problem that could threaten 2 of their properties. My father was working through it, Gail said, but it was genuinely precarious. I sat with that for 3 days. I went back and forth. Part of me, a bigger part than I expected, wanted to do nothing. They had never once taken my work seriously. My father had spent a decade communicating in small and large ways that what I did didn't count. My brother had spent that same decade nodding along. The idea of stepping in felt, in some honest corner of my mind, like exactly the kind of thing they'd never deserved from me. But here's what I kept coming back to. I had built something specifically because I understood what it felt like to be unsupported. If I let that shape me into someone who withholds help when they have it to give, then what exactly had I been building toward? I didn't do it for their gratitude. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I'd made a decision a long time ago about what kind of person I wanted to be, and I wasn't willing to let them cost me that. I worked with my attorney and structured a quiet bridge investment, $3 million routed through a holding company, anonymous at their end. It stabilized two of the properties and bought them time to restructure. Gail knew. No one else did. Life went on. Lumen kept growing. We passed 1,000 artists on the platform that fall. A major athletic brand used our licensing model for a global campaign. I spoke at a design conference in San Francisco and people lined up afterward to ask questions. I got on a plane back to Columbus feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not tried exactly, more like alignment. Like the inside and outside of my life had finally matched. The Forbes thing came in November of that year. A journalist named Rachel had been tracking Lumen for about 8 months, reaching out periodically, and I'd given her access and answered questions and mostly forgotten about the timeline. She called on a Monday morning and said the piece would run that Friday, a feature in the small business and entrepreneurship section. She asked if I wanted to say anything about the origin story. I said I started it at 23 in a bad apartment because I was tired of watching talented people get undervalued. She said that was a good quote. The piece ran that Friday. I read it once, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Bexley, and then I closed my laptop and went and got a very large coffee, and did not tell anyone in my family. I found out my father had seen it from Gail, who texted me on Saturday morning, "Your dad found the article." And then a few minutes later, he doesn't realize. I didn't respond immediately. I just went for a long walk and thought about what I wanted the next chapter of this to look like. That Christmas, I drove home for dinner. Same house, same table, same rituals. My mother made prime rib. My aunt and uncle came. My brother brought his girlfriend, who was perfectly nice and had no idea what she was walking into. I sat in my old chair and helped pass dishes and talked about the weather and football and how the neighborhood had changed. My father waited until after dessert. He'd been quieter than usual through the meal, and I could tell he was working something out internally. Finally, he said, sort of generally toward the table, that he'd come across an interesting article about a company called Lumen, a digital licensing marketplace. Very interesting model, he said. He nodded thoughtfully. Made some comment about how the independent creator economy was growing. My brother said, "Huh, interesting," in that way he had, where you could tell he was performing engagement. My father said he thought it looked like a smart business. He said he didn't know the founder, but whoever had built it clearly understood the space. I put down my fork. I looked at my father. I said, "I know the founder. It's me. Lumen is my company. I built it. It's been my company for 8 years." The table went quiet. Not politely quiet. Not politely quiet. Actually quiet. My brother's girlfriend looked around confused, trying to leave the room. My aunt set down her wine glass. My brother opened his mouth and then closed it again. My father sat very still. My mother made a small sound and then stopped. I wasn't angry when I said it. I want to be clear about that too. I wasn't performing calm. I actually felt calm. Because I'd been carrying this for 8 years, and I'd had a lot of time to figure out how I felt about it. I felt clear. I felt like myself. I said, "I started it the year after my last Thanksgiving here when you asked when I was going to do something real. I just wanted you to know." My father said, and I will remember this for the rest of my life. He said, "Serena, why didn't you tell us?" And I said, "You never asked." My brother, in a moment I genuinely did not anticipate, said, "Wait, so when they wrote about the Blake Capital Bridge investment last spring, was that?" I said, "Yes." The quiet came back, deeper this time. My brother, to his credit, after a long moment, said, "I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." And he sounded genuinely small when he said it, which was not something I'd ever heard from him before. My father didn't speak for what felt like a full minute. When he did, he said, "I owe you an apology." He said it simply, without decorating it. I wasn't fair to you. For a long time. I owe you an apology for that." I nodded. I didn't tell him it was fine because it hadn't been. I said, "I know. Thank you for saying it." My mother was crying quietly. She tends to process everything about 3 beats behind it actually happening, and that's fine. That's just how she works. The conversation didn't suddenly become easy after that. We didn't transform into a different family overnight, but something had shifted, something real and permanent. Like a window that had been painted shut for years had finally been opened and cold air was coming through and everyone was just sitting with it. My brother called me a few days later. He asked a lot of questions about Lumen, actually wanted to understand how it worked, what I'd built, what the hardest years had been like. He asked what it had been like sitting at those family dinners knowing what he didn't. I told him honestly, lonely, mostly, sometimes quietly satisfying, mostly just lonely. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been operating on assumptions he'd never questioned, and that was on him. I believed him. I didn't forget the years of smirking, but I believed him in that moment, and that's where I decided to start. My father and I have had several long conversations since then, the kind we never had before, about how he built his company, about how I built mine, about the years where we were both too proud to really look at each other. He said once that watching me walk through those doors and say those words was one of the most surprising moments of his adult life. He'd been so certain he understood what I was and what I wasn't, he said, that he'd stopped actually seeing me somewhere along the way. He said that out loud directly, which I hadn't expected from him. It counted for something. I won't pretend that one dinner undid everything. I'm not that kind of storyteller. The hurt from those years is real, and it lives somewhere specific in me, and it doesn't vanish because someone finally said sorry. But I also know that what I built during those years wasn't built in spite of my family. Not entirely. It was built partly because I needed to build something that was entirely mine, something no one could diminish or dismiss. And in some strange way, that doubt was part of the fuel. Lumen now has over 4,000 artists on the platform. We've partnered with brands in 22 countries. Last quarter, I hired our 41st employee, and it still catches me off guard sometimes. Standing in our office, watching people work on something I started in a terrible apartment at 23 because I was tired and broke, and someone I loved kept asking when I was going to do something real. This is real. It has been real for a long time. I just had to wait for everyone else to catch up. I've thought a lot about what those 8 years actually cost me. Not financially. Lumen more than answered that question. I mean the other kind of cost. The dinners where I smiled through comments that landed like small punches. The drive home afterward alone, running through the conversation and wondering if some part of them was right. The late nights when the doubt wasn't coming from outside anymore, it had moved in and was sitting at my desk with me. What I know now is that doubt is not the enemy. Doubt kept me honest. Every time I thought maybe I was fooling myself, I went back and looked at the numbers, talked to the artists on the platform, read the emails from people who said Lumen had changed what their career looked like. The doubt made me check my work. The people who never doubted themselves, my brother, for most of those years, they're the ones who stopped growing because they thought they already knew what they were. There's something I want to say about what I did with my father's company, because I know some people hear that part and think I was naive. $3 million anonymously for people who'd spent a decade dismissing me. I understand why that looks questionable from the outside, but I'd built Lumen on the belief that talented people deserve support regardless of whether they've earned it by someone else's standards. I couldn't hold that belief for strangers and then throw it out the window the moment it applied to my own family. That would have made everything I built a lie. The principle only counts if it costs you something sometimes. That's what I mean when I say it wasn't about them. The decision to help, and later the decision to finally tell the truth at that dinner table, those were both about who I was choosing to be, not who they deserved, who I wanted to look like in my own memory of that night. My father said something to me a few months after Christmas, when we were having coffee and actually talking for once. He said he'd spent 30 years building his company, and he thought he knew what building looked like. He thought it looked like suits and conference rooms and deals you could point to. He said watching what I'd done and reading about Lumen, he'd realized he'd had a very narrow idea of what counted. He said that narrowness had cost him his relationship with me for almost a decade, and he was going to have to sit with that. That kind of honesty from him was worth more to me than any apology dressed in excuses. He didn't explain it away. He just held it is. I think about Claudia sometimes. My first hire, who took a salary cut to join something she believed in before there was much evidence she should. She had the same quality I was trying to build in myself. She made a decision based on values, not optics. That's the version of intelligence that actually matters in the long run. Not how fast you can read a room, but whether you can hold your own judgment steady when everyone around you is reading it wrong. 8 years is a long time to be quiet. I won't romanticize it. There were stretches that were genuinely lonely, genuinely hard. But I also think the silence protected something. It kept me building for the right reasons. The moment you start performing a success for an audience that doubted you, you've handed them the controls. I didn't want them to have the controls. I wanted to want what I was building for its own sake. And the only way to test that was to build it when no one was watching. They're watching now. That part is different. But what I built, that part is the same.